Okay, so today we're going deep on a philosopher,
Oh, yeah.
and I bet you can guess who it is.
I have a pretty good idea based on the prep material, but fill me in.
All right, so it's Wang Yangming.
Wang Yangming, fantastic.
Yeah, and we're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our main source.
Of course, a classic.
Yep. And our mission today
Mm-hmm.
is to pull out like the really core ideas of his philosophy,
Yeah.
his relationship to Neo-Confucianism.
Right. Particularly how he departs from Zhu Xi.
Exactly. And then we're going to tie it all together
Okay.
and figure out why this guy still matters. Like, what's the lasting relevance,
Right for us today.
especially for philosophers, you know?
Yeah, for someone who thinks about these big questions.
Exactly. So let's start with Wang Yangming's life.
Okay.
Born in 1472.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't just, some philosopher in an ivory tower.
Right.
This guy was a statesman,
Yeah.
a general.
Very much a man of action.
Yeah. So he was really embedded in the world. So naturally, his early education was like classic Confucianism,
Yeah.
Of
course, the 4 books.
Yeah, with all of Zhu Xi's commentaries.
Mm-hmm. The standard curriculum.
Yeah. But here's what's really interesting.
Okay.
Even with that kind of traditional education,
Yeah.
he was still drawn to other stuff,
Oh, really?
like Taoism.
Interesting.
Yeah. And Buddhism.
Okay, so already we see that he's got like this really inquisitive mind.
Yeah, totally. And this early exploration like really set the stage
Oh.
for a pivotal experience.
Okay.
The bamboo investigation.
Ah, yes, the famous bamboo investigation.
Right. Have you heard about this?
Of course, it's a classic anecdote.
So basically, he and a friend
Mm-hmm.
tried to follow Zhu Xi's method
Okay.
of investigating things to grasp their,
Right.
their underlying pattern.
Yeah, for Zhu Xi, this wasn't just like, casually looking at bamboo.
Yeah.
It was this deep intellectual engagement with the world around you, trying to like really understand
Yeah.
the inherent principle, the pattern present in everything.
Exactly.
And he believed that lie was universal,
Okay.
So through really intense study, you could come to understand this fundamental order of the universe.
But that's what Wang Yangming would later challenge.
Yeah, that idea of like external investigation as the
Yeah.
primary path to knowledge.
Exactly. But anyways, so they're staring at this bamboo
Right.
for days,
Mm-hmm.
just trying to like penetrate its essence.
Okay.
But guess what?
What?
They got nothing. Just exhaustion.
No profound insights?
Nope. And this was like a huge turning point for Wang Yangming
I see.
because it made him question
Yeah.
Zhu Xi's whole method.
Right. Like, can you really find truth by just like looking at the external world?
Yeah, does that really work?
Yeah. And so this kind of pushed him inward
Yeah.
to think about the role of the mind in understanding truth.
Exactly.
So already we see this huge shift away from Zhu Xi's epistemology.
Yeah, but even with these doubts about Zhu Xi,
Okay.
he still went on to have a really successful career as an official, which is kind of ironic because
Yep.
the civil service exams at the time were like totally based on Zhu Xi's interpretations.
Right. That was the dominant paradigm.
Yeah, but even as he's climbing the ranks,
Okay.
his values start to change.
How so?
He starts to care more about like real ethical conduct
I see.
than just being like a brilliant scholar,
Right. So like actually living a virtuous life.
Exactly. And this reflects like a deeper philosophical conviction
Okay.
that real understanding has to show up in your actions,
Yeah.
not just in your head.
Right. There has to be a connection between thought and action.
Exactly. And it's interesting because
Yeah.
he also starts to move away from Taoism and Buddhism,
Oh.
which he had been interested in earlier,
Right.
but he kind of saw them
Okay.
as promoting this detachment from the world,
Interesting.
which he thought
Yeah.
could undermine social responsibility.
Which is obviously like a core value in Confucianism.
Totally. So
Yeah.
he's really starting to solidify his own unique perspective.
Right. But I imagine his engagement with those traditions must have influenced his thinking somehow.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like he integrated certain concepts,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
but in a transformed way.
Okay.
And then in 1506, things get really intense.
What happened?
He protested against this powerful eunuch,
Oh, no.
and he was severely beaten
Oh, wow.
and exiled.
That's a pretty harsh punishment.
Yeah, to this remote and difficult place.
I can't imagine what that must have been like.
Yeah, it was like a real crucible.
Right.
But it was during this exile
Okay.
that he had his big philosophical breakthrough.
Oh, wow.
In 1508,
Okay.
he realized that moral truth isn't something you find outside of yourself.
It's
It's already within you,
Okay.
in your own mind.
Wow. And he even wrote about this in a poem.
Yeah, he said,
Yeah.
following branches and leaves, I searched outside.
That's so powerful. Like he's recognizing the futility of looking externally for moral guidance.
Yeah, exactly. Because he's saying like, hey, we already have this inner compass. We just need to tap into it.
And this is like a radical departure from Zhu Xi's emphasis on studying the classics.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But thankfully, his exile didn't last forever.
Okay.
The eunuch fell from power.
All right.
And Wang Yangming's career took off again.
Oh, wow.
He held all these important positions.
Yeah.
Showing his skills in both like governing and military strategy.
So still a man of action.
Exactly. And during this time, he attracted a bunch of disciples.
Okay.
Who like carefully recorded his teachings.
Mm-hmm.
And these became the record for practice.
Ah, right. A really important text for understanding his philosophy.
Yeah, and it's so cool that these records exist.
Yeah.
You know.
It shows that his philosophy wasn't just theoretical.
Exactly.
It was intertwined with his life.
Yeah, and this really underscores his idea of the unity of knowing and acting.
Oh, yeah, we'll definitely get into that.
Yeah, we'll dive deep into that. But even in his final years, he wrote the Inquiry on the Great Learning.
Oh, right. Like a more concise intro to his ideas.
Yeah, for new students. Okay, and then on his deathbed, he said something so profound.
Yeah. What was it?
This mind is luminous and bright.
Mm-hmm.
What more is there to say?
Wow, like that really sums up his whole philosophy.
Yeah, this idea that truth and goodness are inherent in the mind.
Right, and to really understand the significance of all of this, we need to place him within the context of Neo-Confucianism.
Okay.
And especially the influence of Zhu Xi.
So can you give me like a quick overview of Neo-Confucianism?
Sure. So it emerged as a response to the growing influence of Buddhism in China.
Okay.
Confucian scholars were trying to revitalize their tradition and address some of the deeper metaphysical and ethical questions that Buddhism had raised.
And it's interesting because they actually incorporated some Buddhist ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the concept of an underlying unity and the problem of egoism.
Okay, so they weren't completely rejecting Buddhism.
Right. They were engaging with it critically and selectively.
Yeah, and then Zhu Xi came along, and he created this really influential synthesis of Neo-Confucian thought.
Yeah. His system was based on this interplay between lie, pattern, principle, reason, and qi.
Which is like psychophysical stuff.
The material force of the world.
Okay, so lie is like the underlying structure.
Exactly.
The blueprint of reality.
Yeah, and qi is like the material that it's made of.
Okay, and Zhu Xi said that every entity contains the full lie.
Right, but the difference between things is due to the clarity or turbidity of their qi.
So like how pure it is.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the clearer the qi, the more fully the lie can manifest.
I see. And how does this apply to humans?
Well, humans have relatively clear qi.
Okay.
Which means they have the potential to embody the ethical dimensions of lie.
So like our innate moral knowledge.
Exactly. But our qi can also become clouded by desires. Which obscures our innate goodness.
Okay, and so this whole framework directly shapes their ethics. They put a lot of emphasis on Mencius's idea that human nature is inherently good.
Right.
So they explain moral failings as a result of our desires getting in the way.
Right. Those desires obscure our innate understanding of lie.
Okay. And they elaborated on Mencius's 4 cardinal virtues.
Oh, yeah.
Benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom.
Right.
And they saw these as expressions of lie in human beings.
Exactly. So for them, cultivating virtue was about clarifying our kai.
Okay. And allowing the lie to shine through.
Yeah.
So how did Zhu Xi think people should cultivate these virtues?
Well, he put a huge emphasis on intellectual study.
Right.
Because he believed that our kai is often clouded.
Okay.
We need some external guidance to help us understand the lie within us.
So like teachers and texts?
Exactly, especially the Confucian classics.
Yeah.
With authoritative commentaries to help us understand the principles of lie.
But it wasn't just about intellectual understanding.
Yeah.
He also stressed the importance of Cheng, which is often translated as sincerity.
Yeah, or genuineness. This constant effort to align your thoughts and actions with the lie that you've come to understand.
So it's not enough to just know what's right.
No.
You have to actually live it.
Exactly. But even within this dominant view, there were some critics.
Oh, yeah.
Like Liu Xiangshan, whose ideas would really influence Wang Yangming.
And what did Liu Xiangshan say?
Well, he argued that since lie is already present in the mind, this whole process of investigating things externally was kind of unnecessary.
Interesting.
Like, why go through all that trouble when the truth is already within you?
Right.
He emphasized this innate capacity of the mind
to
grasp moral truth through what Mencius called pure knowing.
So like a direct moral intuition.
Exactly. And he believed that this pure knowing is always there. Even when it's obscured by our selfish desires.
So we just need to turn inward.
Yeah.
And reflect sincerely.
Right. And then we can access this inner moral compass.
Without all the external study. So that's a pretty big difference from Zhu Xi.
Oh, yeah. It's a fundamental difference in their approach to knowledge and ethics.
Okay. So Zhu Xi is all about gradual intellectual understanding through studying the external world.
Right.
And Liu Xiangshan is more about this immediate intuitive grasp of moral truth.
Yeah.
Through introspection.
Exactly.
But by Wang Yangming's time, Zhu Xi's interpretation had become like the dominant orthodoxy.
Wow.
Especially in the civil service exams.
Right. Those exams had so much power and influence.
Yeah, so it was like a huge deal.
And this might have led to a more rigid and intellectualized form of Confucianism.
Exactly.
Okay, so now let's get to Wang Yangming's own philosophy.
Which
you can really see as a continuation and radicalization of Liu Xiangshan's critique.
And his most famous idea is the unity of knowing and acting. Right, and this is where his philosophy gets really interesting for philosophers.
Yeah.
Because he basically says, the mind is pattern. Is there any affair outside the mind? Is there any pattern outside the mind?
So he's basically saying that everything is ultimately rooted in the mind.
Exactly, and that has huge implications.
Yeah.
Because it means that all this theoretical study of ethics that Zhu Xi was so into is kind of unnecessary.
Interesting.
The real key is to realize and act on the pure knowing that's already inside of you.
But a philosopher trained in the Western tradition might have some issues with this.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, we tend to make these clear distinctions between epistemology, ethics, action theory.
And Wang Yangming is kind of collapsing all those categories.
Exactly, it's a very different approach.
Yeah, and I think that highlights a key difference between Chinese and Western philosophy. In the West, we're often really focused on these theoretical distinctions.
Yeah.
But in classical Chinese philosophy, it's more about the integrated cultivation of the whole person.
Right, so it's less about coming up with the perfect ethical theory and more about actually living a virtuous life.
And Wang Yangming's doctrine really addresses that practical problem.
Right.
Of the gap between knowing what's right and actually doing it.
Yeah, that's something we struggle with even today.
Yeah, totally. And he's not messing around with this idea. He says flat out.
Yeah.
There never have been people who know but do not act.
Wow.
Those who know but do not act simply do not yet know.
So he's saying that true knowledge inherently involves action.
Yeah, like you can't really know something unless you're actually living it.
But isn't that kind of a strong claim?
Well, he gives some interesting examples. Like filial piety. He says it's not just about understanding the concept. It's about actually practicing respect and care for your parents. And he also talks about pain, cold, and hunger. He says you can't really know them. Unless you've experienced them firsthand.
Interesting. So he's really emphasizing the experiential and affective dimensions of knowledge?
Exactly. It's not just an intellectual thing. It's connected to our lived reality.
But I could see a philosopher objecting to that.
Yeah.
Like, what about knowing something intellectually without being motivated to act on it in the moment?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Like, I can know the definition of courage without actually doing anything courageous.
Yeah. So how would Wang Yangming respond to that?
Well, he would probably point to the passage in The Great Learning about loving what is lovely and detesting what is detestable. He argues that our immediate response to beauty or foulness shows the connection between knowing and action. Like when you see something beautiful, you naturally feel drawn to it. And when you smell something disgusting, you naturally recoil from it. He's saying that knowing good should work the same way.
So if you really know something is good, you'll naturally be inclined towards it.
Exactly. And that inclination will lead to action.
But couldn't someone still argue that even if you have a strong inclination, you might not act on it?
Right. Like maybe you have other desires that are stronger. or maybe there are external obstacles.
Okay, so it's not always a simple equation.
No, but I think Wang Yangming would say that those are just more reasons to keep cultivating your mind.
Okay.
So that your knowledge of the good becomes so strong that it overrides those other impulses.
So it's an ongoing process.
Exactly.
But I think the most interesting part of Wang Yangming's argument is the pragmatic side of it.
Oh, right.
He's not just making some abstract philosophical point.
Yeah.
He's responding to a real problem that he saw in his own time.
What was the problem?
This separation of intellectual study from ethical living.
Yeah.
Especially among some followers of Zhu Xi.
Oh, I see.
They were so focused on studying the classics that they weren't actually embodying those values in their lives.
Yeah. And Wang Yangming saw that as a real problem.
Exactly. He called it a disease.
Wow. And he saw his doctrine of the unity of knowing and acting as the medicine.
So it's not just a theoretical concept. It's a practical tool for self-cultivation.
Exactly.
And this leads us to Wang Yangming's interpretation of the Great Learning, which is a really important text in Confucianism.
Right, and it had been heavily influenced by Zhu Xi's commentary.
Yeah, but Wang Yangming had some very different ideas about it.
So let's break it down.
Okay.
The Great Learning starts by outlining this path of self-cultivation, and it culminates in Zhiwu, which is traditionally understood as extending knowledge through the investigation of things.
Right, and Zhu Xi interpreted that as encountering things and exhaustively investigating their life.
Okay, so that's what he and his friend were trying to do with the bamboo.
Exactly. He believed that by carefully studying the external world, we could gradually come to understand these universal principles.
Okay, but Wang Yangming completely reinterprets Guwu.
Oh, really? How so? He says it doesn't mean investigating things externally.
Okay.
It means rectifying things.
Rectify.
Yeah, and this rectification involves both our thoughts and the external objects of our concern.
So the focus shifts inward.
Yeah, from external inquiry to internal moral rectification.
Driven by our inherent moral knowledge.
Exactly. And this brings us to the idea of extending knowledge.
Okay.
Zhu Xi saw that as a gradual expansion of our intellectual grasp of life.
Right through that external investigation.
But Wang Yangming says to fully extend one's knowledge is simply to extend fully the pure knowing of my own mind.
So he's connecting it back to that innate moral intuition.
Exactly. And he links this to Mencius's idea of the mind of approval and disapproval, right? Our innate sense of right and wrong.
Yeah, and he says this mind knows without pondering.
So for Wang Yangming, extending knowledge isn't about gaining more info from the outside world.
No.
It's about realizing and enacting the understanding that's already within us.
Right. So it's not about extending our vocabulary.
Yeah, exactly.
It's about extending our arm.
Perfect analogy.
Right. It's about making our innate capacity fully operational.
And he also challenges Zhu Xi's idea that the steps outlined in the Great Learning are sequential.
Right.
He says they're all part of a unified spiritual training.
Oh, interesting. So it's not like you do one, then the other.
No.
They're all happening simultaneously.
Exactly. They're interconnected aspects of a single integrated process.
And how does this apply to the metaphor of loving good and hating evil?
Oh, yeah. So Zhu Xi saw that as like a distant ideal, something you achieve after lots of cultivation.
Right.
But Wang Yangming says it's the immediate and natural response to genuine moral knowing.
Interesting.
So if you really know something is good,
yeah,
you'll naturally be attracted to it.
Right, from the very beginning.
Exactly.
But how can you know something is good if you haven't cultivated yourself yet?
Well, he uses this example
of
someone with a stuffy nose. Okay.
They can't smell a foul odor.
Right.
And he says that's like someone who hasn't truly recognized evil.
I see.
Because if they would, they would naturally be repulsed by it.
Okay, so to sum it up, Zhu Xi's interpretation of the Great Learning is like a recipe,
right?
Step by step, with external investigation and gradual understanding.
Yeah.
But Wang Yangming's interpretation is more like a painting.
Interesting.
All the elements are there from the beginning.
Yeah.
And they all work together to create this unified whole.
So it's a more holistic view.
Exactly.
Emphasizing this inherent moral capacity and the unity of knowing and acting. Now, even though Wang Yangming was mainly focused on ethics and epistemology, his ideas are based on certain metaphysical assumptions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Can you unpack those for us a little?
Sure. So while he wasn't like a systematic metaphysician in the Western sense, he did have a particular understanding of reality that informed his ethical views. And this understanding drew on earlier Neo-Confucian ideas, right, like lie and qi, and the distinction between substance, T, and function. Yeah. Right? Substance is the underlying reality, and function is how it manifests.
Exactly.
Okay. And Wang Yangming argued that the human mind is not separate from this underlying reality.
Interesting.
He said it's actually identical with lie.
So the mind is pattern.
Yeah. And it forms one body with heaven and earth and all creatures.
Wow, that's a pretty profound idea.
Yeah, it's like this vision of interconnectedness.
And this metaphysical unity is the foundation for his ethics.
Okay.
He believed that virtuous people recognize this interconnectedness, while unvirtuous people are trapped in this illusion of separation.
Right, so selfishness is like a denial of this fundamental unity.
Exactly.
And he uses that classic thought experiment from Mencius, the child falling into the well, to illustrate this innate sense of shared being. Like when we see that, we immediately feel this sense of alarm and concern.
Right. And he says that's not just a learned response.
No.
It reflects our underlying unity with the child.
Okay.
And he takes it even further.
Really?
He talks about our distress.
Yeah.
At the suffering of animals, the breaking of plants, even the destruction of inanimate objects.
Interesting.
And he says that these responses, however subtle, indicate this sense of shared being.
That extends beyond just humans.
Exactly.
But I mean, couldn't you also explain those responses in other ways, like maybe through psychology or evolutionary biology?
Right.
Without having to invoke this idea of a universal shared substance?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like maybe we're just wired to care about living things? Or maybe we've learned to empathize with others.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily have to be proof of this deeper metaphysical unity.
So it's an interesting interpretation.
Yeah.
But there might be other explanations. Exactly.
Okay, so what about Wang Yangming's legacy?
Well, he's considered one of the founders of the Luang School, also known as the School of Mind, which was a major alternative to the Chengzu School, or the School of Principle.
So he had a big impact on the development of Confucian thought.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And his ideas were influential not just in China, but also in Japan.
Interesting.
Where his philosophy is known as Oyo Meigaku.
Okay.
And it actually played a role in the intellectual ferment leading up to the Meiji Restoration. Wow, so it had some real-world consequences.
Yeah, but he also had his critics. Like, during the Qing dynasty, the evidential research movement, they criticized Songming Confucianism for being too speculative.
Interesting.
Like, they said it was all empty words.
Oh, wow.
And even within Confucianism, there were figures like Dai Zen who raised some ethical objections to Wang Yangming's ideas.
Okay, like what kind of objections?
Well, they questioned his emphasis on innate moral intuition, and they worried that it might downplay the importance of carefully considered moral principles and the role of physical desires in ethical development.
Interesting. So they thought he wasn't taking those things seriously enough?
Yeah, and in contemporary Chinese philosophy, the new Confucian movement is still engaging with Wang Yangming's thought. Offering different interpretations of his place within the Confucian tradition.
So his legacy is still being debated today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But despite all the different interpretations and critiques, his philosophy is still really fascinating.
For sure.
And it's got a lot to offer.
Yeah.
Especially for philosophers.
What do you think is his most important contribution?
I think it's his emphasis on the unity of knowing and acting.
Yeah.
And his idea that true understanding has to be lived, not just thought about.
And his reinterpretation of the Great Learning is pretty mind-blowing, too.
Yeah, it's like a whole different way of looking at self-cultivation.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've explored his core doctrine, his unique interpretation of the Great Learning, and the metaphysical underpinnings of his thought.
And for you, our philosopher listener, this raises some pretty big questions.
Like
how might the idea that the mind is pattern change the way you approach philosophy?
Interesting.
And what are the implications of prioritizing rectifying things over just investigating things?
Those are great questions to ponder.
Yeah, and if you're intrigued, I highly recommend diving deeper into Wang Yangming's writings and the broader world of Neo-Confucianism.
There's so much to explore.
Yeah, it's a really rich tradition.
Okay. That's it for our deep dive on Wang Yangming.
Hope you enjoyed it.
Until next time.